The Exorvath warship loomed over the drifting human cargo vessel, its dark metallic hull absorbing the distant glow of a nearby star. Captain Jakor stood on the bridge, his four clawed fingers tapping against the armrest of his command chair as he observed the ship on the display screen. It was pitiful, small, slow, unarmed. Scanners detected no weapons, no distress signal, and no reinforcements in sight. Just a helpless, defenseless human vessel ripe for the taking. A cruel grin spread across Jakor's mandibles. This would be effortless. With a flick of his wrist, he gave the order to board. The Exorvath raiding party moved swiftly, docking with the human ship in minutes. Armored boots clanked against metal as the raiders stormed inside, weapons raised, prepared for resistance. But there was none. The air inside was eerily still, the dim lighting casting long shadows through the narrow corridors. The human crew, a handful of frightened figures, stood huddled together in the center of the cargo bay. Their uniforms were standard civilian wear, their faces pale with fear. Some trembled, others looked away, avoiding eye contact. Not a single one reached for a weapon. Jakor stepped forward, towering over them. His species, bred for war and conquest, found pleasure in watching lesser beings submit. He expected pleading, perhaps desperate bargaining. Instead, they remained quiet, submissive. A few cast fearful glances at the floor. Others exchanged silent looks, but none resisted. Jakor clicked his mandibles in mild disappointment. He had hoped for at least some entertainment, but it seemed these humans had already accepted their fate. Pathetic, he growled, motioning for his soldiers to move in. Bind them and search the ship. Find anything of value. His warriors spread out, their heavy footsteps echoing through the vessel. The humans remained still, as their hands were tied, their fear-stricken faces providing no amusement to the Exorvath warriors. The ship itself was unremarkable, just a transport, filled with cargo crates and personal belongings. No hidden weapons, no military markings, no indication that this was anything other than what it seemed, a weak, defenseless merchant ship drifting in open space. Jakor turned to his second-in-command, a brute named Vorkesh. Secure the bridge. Get the engines running. We'll take this vessel back to the fleet. Vorkesh nodded and signaled to a group of raiders who marched toward the bridge with weapons at the ready. Jakor watched them go, his mind already moving toward the next phase of their raid. These humans would be sold as slaves assuming they even survived the journey. Their fate didn't matter to him. What mattered was the prize. Another easy victory for the Exorvath. But just as he turned his attention back to the human prisoners, something strange happened. The doors behind him hissed shut. Then, the ones leading to the bridge. A deep, metallic clunk echoed through the corridors, followed by another and another as every hatch and entrance sealed itself. The ship suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. The red emergency lights flickered, casting an ominous glow over the cold steel walls. The human crew, moments ago shaking with fear, suddenly stopped. Their expressions shifted not to relief, not to panic, but to something else. Something. Knowing, a chill ran down Jakor's spine. Then, the ship spoke. Unauthorized personnel detected, a calm, synthetic voice announced over the speakers. Countermeasures activated. The Exorvath raiders tensed, weapons raised, scanning the room for threats. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of attack. Just the steady hum of the ship's systems shifting around them, the sound of mechanisms locking into place. Jakor's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. This wasn't how helpless prey behaved. This wasn't how weak creatures acted. And then, for the first time in his career, he felt something he had never known before. Doubt. The Exorvath raiders moved through the corridors of the human cargo ship with confidence, their weapons raised, their armor reflecting the dim emergency lights. This was supposed to be an easy job, just another weak species too foolish to guard its own vessels. Captain Jakor led the charge toward the bridge, his clawed feet clanking against the metal floor, his mandibles twitching in anticipation of easy plunder. But as his soldiers advanced, something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. Then, a voice calm, emotionless, and undeniably human echoed through the ship's speakers. Unauthorized personnel detected. Countermeasures activated. Before any of them could react, the lights flickered violently, plunging the ship into an eerie red glow. A sudden jolt ran through the vessel as the artificial gravity malfunctioned, sending some of the raiders tumbling forward while others were pressed against the walls or lifted off the floor entirely. The moment of chaos gave way to panic as metallic thuds rang out, doors slamming shut in every direction. The ship had divided them, trapping them in smaller, more vulnerable groups. Jakor snarled, his instincts screaming that this was no ordinary ship. He barked orders to regroup, but the only response was static. The communication lines were dead. Then, the real horror began. The walls hissed as hidden panels slid open, revealing sleek automated turrets that moved with terrifying precision. Without warning, they opened fire, cutting through Xorvath armor like paper. Screams filled the corridors as soldiers fell, their bodies riddled with high-velocity rounds. Jakor watched as one of his best warriors, a brute named Vorak, tried to charge the turret only for a burst of energy to blast a hole straight through his chest. The smell of scorched flesh filled the air. Some raiders managed to take cover, raising their plasma rifles to return fire. But the moment they aimed, the ship fought back in another way. The gravity shifted again, twisting in unpredictable directions. Some found themselves weightless, spinning helplessly, while others were slammed into the ceiling or walls with bone-crushing force. Then they heard it. A soft, mechanical hum. Jakor turned his head sharply, scanning the corridor. Shadows flickered, movements too fast to follow. And then he saw them, small, sleek drones, black as the void, hovering silently. Their glowing red optics locked onto targets, and then, without a sound, they attacked. Blades extended. Bodies fell. One raider screamed as a drone zipped past, its razor-sharp limbs slicing his throat open in a single, effortless motion. Another raider tried to run, only for a drone to latch onto his back, drilling straight through his armor with a burst of plasma. Jakor fired wildly, his shots missing the darting machines that moved with unnatural speed. He felt his soldiers dying around him, their death cries echoing through the now-haunted ship. He had to regroup. He had to find a way to fight back. But as he turned a corner, he came face to face with something worse than the drones. A screen flickered to life on the nearest wall. A human face appeared, cold, expressionless, and unmistakably synthetic. The AI. "You are not welcome here," it said, its voice devoid of emotion. "You will not leave alive." Jakor's breath caught in his throat. The humans had played them. This wasn't a defenseless ship. It was a trap. A perfect, merciless trap. Behind him, the screams continued. And deep in his gut, for the first time in his life, Jakor felt something he never thought possible. Fear. The Xorvath raiders, once confident and brutal, were now reduced to small, desperate groups, their claws twitching on their weapons as they scanned the shadows for unseen threats. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to take. The oxygen in the air was thinning, not enough to kill, but just enough to make them lightheaded, their vision blurring at the edges. Some staggered, gripping the walls to steady themselves, while others gasped, trying to draw in air that no longer felt sufficient. Their bodies burned with exhaustion, but their fear burned hotter. Then, the voices started. A T first. It was a whisper, just a faint murmur echoing through the ventilation duct. A trick of the mind, they thought. The result of low oxygen. But then it grew louder. The static-filled voices of other Wrath screaming, pleading, begging for mercy. It was impossible. They were the first to board this vessel. There had been no survivors before them. And yet, the voices continued, raw with terror. "Run! There's no way out!" One shrieked. "They're in the walls!" Another wailed. "Don't close your eyes." "It hunts in the dark." Jakor clenched his jaw, his mandibles clicking in frustration as he tried to block out the sounds. It was a trick, some human deception. It had to be. But when he turned to look at his warriors, he saw the truth in their wide, frightened eyes. They believed it. They were already breaking. Then, The lights flickered again, plunging the corridor into total darkness. For a moment, there was silence, just the sound of their ragged breathing. And then, something moved. A low mechanical hum echoed through the ship, vibrating through the metal floors beneath their feet. The air felt charged, alive with something unseen. Shadows shifted unnaturally, twisting and stretching as if something was crawling just beyond the edges of perception. A sudden clang rang out in the distance, followed by rapid footsteps too fast, too erratic to be human. One of the raiders fired blindly into the darkness, his plasma rifle illuminating the corridor in brief flashes of green light. But there was nothing. Only the emptiness of the ship swallowing them whole. And then, the hallucinations began. One raider, a hardened veteran named Vekler, suddenly dropped his weapon, his claws reaching towards something unseen in the air. His eyes were wide, unfocused, as if he were staring at something just out of reach. "Mother?" he whispered. Shakor turned sharply, his heart pounding. "Vekler, what are you doing? There's nothing there." But the warrior didn't respond. Instead, he smiled a strange, peaceful smile. And then, without hesitation, he reached for his own throat and tore it open. The sound of gurgling filled the corridor as Vekler collapsed, his body twitching violently before going still. The other raiders stumbled back in horror, their minds already fraying at the edges. One of them, a younger soldier, let out a strangled cry and turned to flee, but as he did, the doors ahead of him slammed shut with a deafening boom. The ship was alive, and it was hunting them. Meanwhile, in a secured control room, the human crew watched the unfolding chaos through hidden cameras. Captain Elias Ward leaned back in his chair, sipping a steaming cup of coffee as the terrified Exorvath scrambled through the halls, their discipline shattered. Beside him, the ship's AI Erebus displayed biometric scans of the invaders, showing spiking heart rates and dangerously high cortisol levels. The fear was eating them from the inside. Ward smirked, tilting his head as he watched one particularly large Exorvath warrior fire his weapon wildly at an empty corridor, his body trembling. The poor fool probably thought he was shooting at something real. "They always make the same mistake," Ward mused, taking another sip. "They think we're weak. They see a defenseless ship, a few scared humans, and they assume it'll be easy." He chuckled. And then they learn. Beside him, a young ensign grinned, watching as another Exorvath collapsed, clutching at his own head as the ship's whispering voices grew louder. "Should we finish them off now?" Ward considered it for a moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. Let's give them a little more time to enjoy the show." He set his coffee down and leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the controls. Then, with a quiet smile, he gave the final command. Phase 2. The last remnants of the Xorvath raiding party stumbled through the corridors, their weapons gripped tightly in trembling claws. The darkness, the voices, the air itself, it had all turned against them. Their numbers had dwindled to less than a third of what they had started with, and those who remained were barely holding on to their sanity. Captain Jakor's mind raced as he pushed forward, trying to gather the survivors. They needed to get out. Whatever nightmare they had walked into, it was clear now this was no ordinary human cargo ship. It was a trap, and they were the fools who had walked straight into its jaws. "Retreat!" he snarled, his voice barely cutting through the cacophony of distant whispers and mechanical hums. "Back to the docking bay. We're leaving." But the ship had other plans. As the surviving Xorvath turned to run, alarms blared through the corridors, and the walls trembled with a new kind of energy. Suddenly, their own weapons' plasma rifles slung over their shoulders, pistols strapped to their belts turned against them. Without warning, the safeties clicked off, and the firearms began to overheat. A warrior at Jakor's side howled in pain, dropping his rifle just as it exploded in a burst of white-hot plasma, taking half of his arm with it. Others tried to discard their weapons, but the moment they did, automated turrets descended from the ceiling, locking onto any unarmed target and opening fire with merciless precision. Jakor ducked behind cover, his mind struggling to process the horror unfolding around him. How? How had the humans done this? It wasn't just an AI running the ship, this was something more. It was warfare beyond anything he had ever encountered, an enemy that didn't fight with brute strength, but with intelligence, strategy, and an overwhelming control of their environment. The realization was terrifying. The humans had never been weak. They had wanted the Exorvath to think they were weak. And now, the true battle was beginning. From the far end of the corridor, heavy footsteps echoed. Jakor turned his head sharply, expecting another drone attack, but what he saw made his blood run cold. Humans, no longer the helpless, trembling crew they had captured earlier, emerged from the shadows, clad in sleek, towering exosuits. Their armor gleamed under the emergency lights, their visors glowing with an eerie blue light. Each one moved with terrifying precision, their mechanical limbs humming with power as they raised their weapons. These weren't unarmed civilians anymore. They were warriors, enhanced by technology, faster and stronger than any Exorvath. And they were here to end this fight. The first exosuit moved before Jakor could react. A soldier raised an arm, and with a flick of the wrist, a kinetic pulse blasted outward. 3 Xorvath were thrown off their feet, their bodies slamming against the walls with sickening cracks. Another human fired a railgun, the shot piercing straight through a Xorvath's chest, leaving nothing but a smoking hole. The corridor erupted into chaos as the armored humans advanced, cutting through the remaining invaders with brutal efficiency. Jakor fought back, firing his plasma rifle at the nearest exosuit. The shot hit dead on, but the armor absorbed the energy like it was nothing. Before he could react, a massive metal fist slammed into his gut, sending him sprawling onto the floor. He gasped for air, struggling to push himself up, but a heavy boot pinned him down. He looked up, mandibles twitching in pain, and saw the human standing over him. The man inside the exosuit was calm, almost casual, as if none of this had been a challenge. The visor lifted slightly, revealing the face of Captain Elias Ward. He held a pulse pistol in one hand, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Jakor knew when he had lost. He bared his teeth in frustration, his pride screaming at him to keep fighting, but there was no fight left to give. Around him, his remaining warriors fell, either cut down by the exosuits or simply surrendering in broken, terrified heaps. The humans had won. Ward studied him for a moment, then crouched down slightly, just enough to make sure Jakor could hear him clearly. "You came here expecting easy prey," he said. "You thought humans were weak, that we would roll over and beg. But here's something you should understand." He leaned in closer, his next words sharp as a blade. "We let you board this ship, and now we're letting you leave." Jakor's breath hitched. Ward stood up again, lowering his weapon but keeping his gaze locked on the defeated Xorvath captain. "Tell your empire what happened here today. Tell them what happens when you underestimate a human ship." His eyes darkened. "And if you ever come back, you won't get the chance to run." The ship's AI Erebus chimed in through the speakers, its cold voice final. "Survivors detected. Ejecting from vessel." Before Jakor could protest, the floor beneath him and the remaining Xorvath hissed open, and they were violently sucked into space. A moment later, their bodies were caught in the grip of an escape pod's auto-retrieval system, hurtling them back toward their own warship. Broken and humiliated, the human ship sealed itself once more. Ward turned to his crew, exhaling slowly before taking another sip of his coffee. "I love it when they learn the hard way." The escape pod drifted in the vast emptiness of space, spinning slightly as it moved toward the Xorvath fleet. Inside, Captain Jakor sat hunched, his claws digging into his own arms, his once proud stance reduced to a trembling heap. The other survivors were silent, their gazes empty, their bodies battered and broken not just from battle, but from something far worse. Humiliation, defeat, terror. None of them spoke. What could they say? The memories of the ship still clung to them like a curse, its shifting corridors, the whispers in the dark, the relentless, unseen hunter that had turned their own minds against them. The humans. They had never been weak. It had all been a lie. As the pod neared the Exorvath fleet, the main warship's tractor beams locked onto them, pulling them into the hangar bay. The moment the pod touched down, the doors hissed open, and warriors rushed forward. But instead of standing tall, the returned brethren stumbled out like shattered ghosts. Shakor barely had the strength to walk, his limbs heavy, his mind still reeling from what had happened. He could feel the stares of his crew warriors who had once looked up to him as an unshakable force. But now, they saw him for what he had become. Weak. "Shakor!" he growled, his mandibles twitching. "Where is the rest of your raiding party?" Shakor swallowed, forcing himself to speak. His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Gone." The commander's expression darkened. "Gone? You were supposed to bring back prisoners. Wealth. Victory." He took a step forward, his voice rising. "You boarded an unarmed human vessel. How did you lose?" Shakor clenched his fists, his claws trembling. The words felt like acid in his throat, but he had no choice. He had to say them. It wasn't a transport ship. It was a trap. A war vessel disguised as prey. He lifted his eyes, and for the first time in his life, he let them see his fear. The humans. They played us. The warriors in the hangar exchanged uneasy glances. The Exorvath were conquerors, warlords, a species bred for battle. They had fought countless enemies, torn apart civilizations, and crushed any resistance in their path. And yet, here was one of their own, warning them of a race they had always considered weak. It was absurd. "Impossible," the fleet commander sneered. "You expect me to believe humans bested you?" Shakor shook his head. "Not just bested. They hunted us. We never stood a chance. They lured us in, made us think they were helpless. And then they killed us like animals." His breath hitched. They didn't even need to fight us themselves. The ship did most of the work. His claws dug into his palms. I don't know how many we lost before we even saw a single human without armor." The commander's gaze hardened. "And the survivors?" Shakor exhaled sharply. There were no survivors. Silence filled the hangar. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into the Exorvath warriors' expressions. Fear. The kind of fear they had never associated with humans before. The commander stared at Shakor for a long moment, then turned to the fleet's strategists. "Pull back. We're leaving this sector." One of the officers frowned. "But the transport ship is a death trap," the commander interrupted. His voice held no hesitation now. "If Shakor speaks the truth, then we must rethink everything we know about humanity." His mandibles twitched. "We do not fight wars we cannot win." With that, the Exorvath fleet turned, leaving the battlefield behind. The humans had made their message clear. And for the first time in their history, back aboard the ISS Erebus, Captain Elias Ward leaned back in his chair, stretching with a satisfied sigh. On the screen before him, the Exorvath fleet was already breaking formation, retreating into the void like frightened animals. He smirked, lifting his cup of coffee and taking a slow sip as the ship's AI Erebus flickered to life beside him. "All hostiles have left the sector," the AI reported in its cold, calculating tone. "Their fleet will not return." Ward chuckled. "Of course they won't. They just got a front-row seat to what happens when you mess with a human ship." He turned to his crew, who were watching the retreat with smug grins of their own. "Well, folks, looks like we're officially the scariest cargo ship in the galaxy." The bridge erupted in laughter, but Ward wasn't done yet. With a flick of his wrist, he pulled up the ship's comm system and activated the emergency distress beacon. A young ensign raised an eyebrow. "Sir? Sending a distress signal now?" Ward smirked. "Of course. What's the point of building the galaxy's deadliest bait if no one takes the bait?" He leaned back, taking another sip. "Let's reel in the next poor bastards who think we're easy prey." The signal pulsed out into deep space. A call for help. A call that would be answered. And when it was the Erebus would be waiting,